The tragic and shocking murder of 50-year-old Brenda Powell by her own daughter in March 2020 sent ripples of grief and disbelief throughout their small Ohio community. 19-year-old Sydney Powell had just started her second year at Mount Union University when she took her mother's life in their family home. To neighbors, the Powell family seemed happy and normal. Parents Steve and Brenda doted on Sydney and her younger brother Andrew. By all accounts, Sydney and Brenda shared an incredibly close bond, which makes the brutal crime all the more difficult to comprehend. Just 2 years earlier, Sydney was finishing an impressive high school career. She excelled both academically and athletically. Sydney made the honor roll all 4 years and served as captain of the soccer team her senior season. Her natural smarts and dedication earned her a scholarship to nearby Mount Union. When Sydney moved into her college dorm in 2018, she appeared excited and ready to thrive. The future seemed bright. Yet, in one fateful afternoon, the Powell family trajectory veered into tragedy and darkness. While Brenda was on the phone with college officials regarding Sydney's poor academic performance, the unthinkable happened. Her beloved daughter viciously attacked. The brutal assault occurred just minutes after Brenda arrived home, expecting a calm discussion with Sydney. But triggered by mounting lies and anxiety over her grades, Sydney exploded with shocking violence. Using weapons from the family kitchen, she beat and stabbed her mother to death. In the aftermath, Sydney would claim temporary insanity and delusions, but prosecutors argued that Sydney remained conscious of her actions. The horrific crime left the Powell family, friends, and larger community reeling. They were forced to grapple with the senseless loss of Brenda Powell, as well as ponder whether Sydney was truly detached from reality when she carried out her deadly attack.
It is a crime that rocked an Akron neighborhood yesterday, and now there are new, shocking details. Today, police said a young woman is responsible for a brutal attack that left her mother dead. As News 5's Bob Jones reports, detectives are still trying to figure out why this happened.
When Sydney Powell arrived on Mount Union's campus in August 2018, she embarked on her college experience with enthusiasm. This initial freshman year unfolded as a rather typical one. Sydney lived in a dorm suite with her best friend from high school, Lauren Curry. The two childhood buddies had dreamed of one day becoming college roommates. Now, with Lauren by her side, Sydney quickly acclimated to campus life. She and Lauren joined a sorority, allowing Sydney another instant circle of friends and round of parties and activities. Extremely sociable by nature when around peers, Sydney flourished with this robust college social calendar. Academically, Sydney also appeared perfectly capable of managing the new academic rigor. Though known to be occasionally anxious about schoolwork, she earned solid grades her first semester. When she arrived back home in Akron for winter break that December, her family found her happy and full of amusing new stories about dorm mishaps and late-night campus happenings. The adjustment to college posed Sydney with few problems initially. In many ways, Sydney's immersion in the college experience during that first year was precisely what Steve and Brenda Powell hoped for when sending their daughter off to Mount Union. The small private school offered a nurturing environment not too far from home. After watching Sydney spread her wings socially, the Powell parents felt reassured she had the right balance of independence and support. Her thicker circle of college friends brought Sydney out of her shell a bit too. Since forging such an unusually close relationship with her mother especially, Sydney had always been shy around others until she got to know them. But at Mount Union, she grew more confident. For Steve and Brenda, Sydney's initial transition exceeded their highest expectations. She came home for brief visits with heads full of exciting plans for the next semester or sorority event. Proud of the bright, engaged, graceful young woman Sydney was becoming, the Powell parents looked forward to 3 more years of watching her thrive in college. But unbeknownst to her family back home, Sydney's initially smooth college experience hit its first major snag early in her second year at Mount Union. As she began fall classes in late August 2019, trouble was quietly brewing. Sydney struggled to keep up with coursework demands. Perhaps more interested in campus social activities, Sydney failed to attend classes or complete assignments reliably. She earned poor marks that first semester of her sophomore year. Then, right before winter break, Sydney received devastating news. Due to her failing grades, she was placed on academic probation. This meant if her grades did not improve the following semester, she would face suspension. Still, instead of informing her parents of her probation status and that her scholarship was in jeopardy, Sydney told no one. In January 2020, she returned to Mount Union and moved back into her dorm as if nothing had happened. Unfortunately, Sydney's grades did not improve that spring semester. By continuing to fail classes, Sydney was soon formally suspended from Mount Union. She was forbidden from living on campus or attending classes, yet she carried on with the facade, pretending to still be a university student. She moved out of her dorm and started staying in hotels in the area, paying for her stay with the money her dad thought was for her tuition. As far as friends could tell, Sydney seemed excited about the new semester, and by all accounts, she was a regular college student. Sydney managed to hide her secret through the month of January, but her house of cards would soon come crumbling down. While still living the facade and trying to sit in on classes and sorority events in February, Mount Union administrators confronted her. They reiterated that as a suspended student, Sydney was prohibited from campus grounds and facilities. Sydney told officials that her parents were struggling and she wished to avoid worrying them, so she asked them for an extension to allow her time to vacate the campus. The administration initially agreed and set strict timelines for Sydney to vacate, yet she failed to comply with multiple warnings. On February 24th, almost 2 months into the spring 2020 term, security had to intervene and forbid Sydney from remaining on campus. Finally forced to reckon with losing her scholarship and status as a student, Sydney had nowhere to hide anymore. Her elaborate rows to keep up perfect appearances could not withstand the school's decisive actions. After years of relentless high achievement, Sydney suddenly found herself at risk of being a failure, both in her own mind and that of her proud, loving family. The pressures welled inside, setting the stage for an emotional eruption.
And just briefly, I'm going to go ahead and put this on the document camera. These are specifically, I'm going to draw your attention to the top left. These are specifically the transcripts for Miss Sydney Powell.
Yes.
Okay. And those are the classes she was enrolled in specifically
Yes.
in those semesters?
Correct.
Okay. And the transcripts ends at the end of the fall of 2019. She wasn't enrolled for the spring.
Correct.
Now, Miss Gaffney, back to after that conversation with Miss Powell, she said she just needed a few days. What happened next?
The following, after that date elapsed, we became aware that Sydney was still spending quite a bit of time in the hall, more than enough that it seemed as though she was still living there. According to the hall staff who had checked to see if she had moved. And we found that she had not, in fact, moved out and
In
was
the
still
dorm?
of the residence hall and was still coming and going that following week.
Okay, so what did you guys do next?
We again asked Sydney to come over to the office. I think we had a staff member find her over in the residence hall and bring her over to the office. And
Okay, was she able to meet with you?
she was, yeah.
Okay, and what happened at that second meeting?
So when she came over for that meeting, she met with myself and Dean Frazier, our Vice President of Student Affairs.
Is that John Frazier?
John Frazier,
Okay.
right. We met with her together to indicate that we needed to talk about the fact that she was still living on campus despite not being enrolled, and that we couldn't continue to have her living on campus.
Do you know when this might have been during the spring semester?
It was in February.
In February, okay. And what happened? What was Sydney's reaction to that second conversation?
She understood. She was just taking her longer to move out. She needed a little bit more time. We asked if she had shared with her parents the fact that she wasn't enrolled. She said that she had, and because we again offered, would it help if we would to have a conversation? Would you want to call your parents and see if they could come down and help you move out?
And Ms. Powell told you that she already told them?
And then, yes.
Okay.
And that they were having that they were on vacation, in fact. They weren't home. And that they were having a lot of problems with her little brother. And she didn't want to bother them because of all the issues they were having with her little brother.
Okay. And
Just when the extent of Sydney's issues began to surface, the long-kept secret erupted in irreversible tragedy. On the morning of March 3rd, 2020, matters came to a head. Sydney's father, Steve, while attempting to log into his daughter's university account, found himself mysteriously locked out. He then checked Sydney's location through their family app. He noticed that it showed that Sydney was at their Akron home when she should have been at campus. He immediately sensed something amiss, so he called Mount Union and spoke with school administrators, learning the devastating news that Sydney was no longer enrolled. Alarmed at the startling turn, Steve promptly left work at 11:30 a.m. and rushed home to confront his daughter. He left his phone at work so that Sydney couldn't track his movement on the app, and ended up leaving before he even got there. When Steve got home, sure enough, there was Sydney. She had no choice but to finally confess the full story to her father. She admitted to failing classes and being told to leave campus weeks earlier. Caught off guard by the revelations, Steve suggested calling Brenda, the family member most adept at navigating emotional dialogues. Yet as worried parents focused on supporting their daughter, no one could anticipate just how rapidly this family crisis would spin into abject tragedy. With Stephen on his way back to work, Brenda was making her way home to speak to her daughter. She arrived home shortly before noon and called the university for clarity on Sydney's standing and retracing of events. University Dean John Fraser fielded the call in his office, with Associate Dean Michelle Gaffney by his side, listening on speakerphone. As they initiated the difficult conversation at 12:36 p.m., unbeknownst even to them, Sydney planned to stop her mother from finding out the truth even at that late stage. While still talking to Brenda, they suddenly heard a blood-curdling scream ripping through the room, followed by several loud thuds and sounds of a struggle. Startled, the dean repeatedly shouted Brenda's name.
Dean Fraser was sitting at his desk, and I was sitting next to it. He dialed. The phone was answered, and Mrs. Powell answered.
You say Mrs. Powell, is that Brenda who answered?
Brenda answered, yes.
Okay. And what did you tell Brenda at that time?
So Dean Fraser was speaking and simply said, Brenda, this is Dean Fraser. I'm sitting here with Michelle Gaffney, our associate dean of students. We're returning your call, and that's about as far as we got. Did
Brenda respond to that introduction at all?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
What did she say?
I think he asked, "Is this Brenda Powell?"
Oh, okay.
And she said yes, and then he identified himself.
Okay. And Miss Gaffney, what happened next?
There was a very large or a very loud sort of thud sound, like a pounding or a thud, accompanied by a pretty loud scream, and the scream might have actually been first, and then the thud.
Okay.
As I think about it, and then there was sort of an expulsion. The other sound that I heard at that same time, or right after, was sort of an expulsion of air, like the air was knocked out of somebody.
Okay.
I'd always heard that expression of the air being knocked, having the wind knocked out of you, but I didn't. That's actually what it sounded like. And then several more repeated thuds. I don't know how to describe the sound.
No, and that's okay. And you and Mr. Fraser could hear this from the other end of the phone.
It was on speakerphone, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you hear any communication during these thuds?
Just the screaming, and so we were both talking into the phone, saying, what's happening? Are you okay? Do you need help? What's going on?
Yeah, can you describe your mindset at this time?
I mean, it very definitely felt like someone was being attacked, and so we weren't getting an answer. I think at some point I said, if you can't respond, we're going to call the police. If we don't hear if no one can tell us what's going on, the dean's has an administrative assistant right outside his door. So I said, well, I'm going to get Sydney's address. And he kept talking. And so,
Mr. Fraser?
Mr. Fraser, yeah, Dean Fraser. So I opened the door and told our admin, I said, I need Sydney Powell's address right away. And in the meantime, I had my phone and I was looking up the number for the Akron Police Department.
Why didn't, let me ask you this. Sorry, I interrupt you again.
It's okay.
Why didn't you want to call 911?
Because I knew it would go to Stark County Dispatch. I work with our security and the Alliance Police quite a bit.
Okay.
And we actually, when we need the police, we call the Alliance Police Dispatch and not 911 because it goes to Stark County and not Alliance.
Okay.
And they often don't it takes longer.
So you wanted to get directly
I wanted to get directly
with...
to, I knew she was from Akron. I wanted to get directly to the Akron police, so.
And Ms. Gaffney, can you describe how that phone call continued or what happened next?
So while Tara is our assistant, while Tara was looking up that address, the phone cut off at some point after. I would say that somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 or 7 of those thuddings, those sort of thud sounds. And the screaming had continued.
And when you say the phone cut off, did the call drop or
the
was
call
it
dropped?
Okay.
We lost the call.
Okay.
And so we decided to keep, while we were waiting for the address, to keep calling. We called the number back.
Brenda's number?
Brenda's number that she'd left, and we called twice, and there was no answer. It rang and rang and rang and no answer. When it went to voicemail, we hung up and we called again. And then on the third time, and I had just gotten the address as the phone was answered.
Okay.
On the third try to the number, and Dean Frazier said something along the lines of, "Brenda, is that you? Are you there?" And the voice on the other end said, "Yes, this is Brenda." Yes, this is Brenda.
Now, Ms. Gaffney, did you recognize that voice on the line?
Yeah.
Okay, was that Brenda Powell?
It was not Brenda.
Who did you recognize that voice to be?
I was sure it was Sydney. Both Dean Frazier and I looked at each other and sort of shook our heads at each other and said, that's not Brenda. And he then said, I don't, Sydney, I think this is you. This is not Brenda.
And what happened next?
The phone went dead.
Okay.
Associate Dean Michelle Gaffney immediately notified authorities, and police soon swarmed the Powell household. Upon entry, a ghastly scene stunned responders. Sydney Powell stood in the living room, covered in blood and detached from reality. She was unresponsive to initial questions, alternating between hysterical wailing and eerie catatonic states. As officers tried settling her erratic behavior, others made their way through the house to investigate further. In the master bedroom, they discovered the lifeless body of Brenda Powell. She had suffered excessive blood loss from over 20 savage stab wounds, as well as endless blunt force trauma to her head. A little bit away from her body, they found a cast iron skillet and a large kitchen knife, both stained red with blood and hair. When police finally managed to call down Sydney, and when she was somewhat conscious, they managed to ask her what had happened. Sydney rambled an account suggesting an intruder had perpetrated the horrors within her home. According to her version, an unknown man had broken into the house through a window or back door. She told officers that the intruder then started attacking her mother, and while Brenda was in the process of defending herself, she yelled at Sydney to run away and save herself. Sydney said that she then went and hid elsewhere in the house for an unknown period of time, only hearing screams and loud noises. She told police that after things went silent, she eventually emerged from hiding and discovered her mother fatally wounded. At that point, Sydney said the perpetrator had already left, likely escaping back out the broken window. Still, even when pressed, Sydney stressed that she didn't see who had attacked her mother or understand why. However, several pieces of evidence contradicted Sydney's intruder story and pointed to her as the actual perpetrator. The back window that was supposedly broken by an intruder to gain entry actually had blood smears on the outside. This indicated the window was broken from the inside, likely by Sydney after Brenda had already been attacked. In addition, Sydney had visible wounds on her hands and arms consistent with injuries sustained while stabbing someone. And while she claimed her mother yelled at her to flee just as the attack started, it seemed unlikely Brenda would tell her daughter to leave her alone to fight off an attacker. Finally, when considering the sheer brutality of Brenda's injuries, an intruder with no personal motive would likely not stab a victim over 20 times. The nature of the overkill assault signaled an emotional element between victim and killer. For all these reasons, investigators determined that Sydney staged the crime scene herself in an attempt to cover up her own involvement. With evidence contradicting her statements, police arrested Sydney Powell. In April 2020, she was formally charged with her mother's murder and taken into custody. However, just days later, on April 17th, Sydney's grandmother posted $25,000 bail, allowing for Sydney's temporary release. Sydney then moved in with her grandmother while she awaited further legal proceedings. When Sydney finally stood trial in September 2023, her defense team pursued a not guilty plea, citing temporary insanity. Her attorneys argued Sydney experienced a severe psychotic breakdown, which prevented her from understanding right from wrong or comprehending the consequences of her violent actions. They contended that Sydney had schizophrenia, which made her detached from reality in the months before the tragic incident. This was apparently evident in her delusion that she was still enrolled in college and attending class despite being suspended. Over a 12-day trial, Sydney's defense team called 3 mental health experts to testify that she met the legal definition of insanity due to psychosis. The prosecution, on the other hand, maintained Sydney was conscious of her choices before, during, and after the crime. They cited her attempts to stage the scene and deny involvement as proof she could still actively work to conceal guilt. A psychologist appearing for the state further contested the schizophrenia claims, stating Sydney instead had anxiety and personality disorders. Both sides passionately argued their version of events over 2 weeks of witness testimony. Yet ultimately, on September 20th, 2023, the jury sided with the prosecution. They found Sydney guilty on all charges related to her mother's murder, including felonious assault and tampering with evidence. Sydney now faced up to life behind bars, no longer able to deny her role in the horrific attack.
The jury has found an Akron woman guilty of stabbing her mother to death more than 3 years ago. Investigators say Sydney Powell and her mother Brenda got into an argument in March of 2020. It turned deadly when Sydney stabbed her mother several times. Sydney was 19 at the time of the crime. She pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. The jury found her guilty on all charges, including murder. She'll be sentenced next month.
On September 28th, the judge upheld the jury's decision and handed down Sydney's official sentence. Citing the violent nature of the offenses and her refusal to accept full responsibility, she gave her the maximum penalty. Sydney Powell received an indefinite sentence of 15 years to life in prison, ensuring she will remain incarcerated until at least age 38 years old, when she will first become eligible for parole. The outcome provided little comfort to those most devastated by Brenda Powell's tragic death, her family and friends, the local community, as well as Sydney's own loved ones. All of them struggled to make sense of the shocking violence from a formerly model teenager. And they mourned the loss of Brenda, a dedicated mother and selfless volunteer whose life was cut short by the disturbing actions of her beloved daughter Sydney. The ripple effects of Sydney's choice permanently and painfully altered so many lives connected to the once happy Powell family.